Alright folks, welcome back. Let's talk about earthbending, specifically the strongest earthbender, the fastbender. I built this deck for our friend Rarran, who maybe doesn't get to play as much commander as he'd like, so I designed this to be a bracket 2 deck with no infinite combos and no tutors. Even though Rarran is a savvy strategist, he doesn't have an encyclopedic knowledge of all the cards, so I don't want him to get lost in the sauce when he's searching the library. As an aside, one of my favorite land-based combos is using something like Tempt with Discovery to search up Urborg and then play Roots of Life. This does not actually target, by the way, they updated the wording on this. What happens is anytime any opponent taps their lands, you're gaining 1 life for each land being tapped. If everyone has 5 lands, you're gaining 15 life in 1 turn cycle. But if we're not using these land tutors to search up things like Urborg, then it doesn't make sense for us to do Roots of Life in this deck. Now, when building around Toph as a commander, it's important to keep in mind this earthbending ability happening at the end of your turns is only happening once per turn, which really limits the combo potential, and the ability to turn artifacts into lands only affects your non-token artifacts. Finally, these lands don't automatically gain a mana ability, so Toph is not ramping you. Toph is not drawing cards, and this earthbending ability is not a serious way of winning the game, so we have to carve out room in the deck for all of these things. Let's start with ramp. At 1 mana, we got 3 copies of Soul Ring. On top of that, Skyshroud Ranger and Soccer Tribe Scout are generally worse than Exploration, but probably good enough in a deck that cares about deploying a lot of lands. At 2 mana, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits all ramp you by 1 for only 2 mana. Explorer is sometimes worse, but generally better, especially with things like Lotus Cobra, giving you more mana every time you deploy a land. If you sacrifice your Arid Mesa to search up a Savannah, Lotus Cobra is giving you 2 mana on that turn, in addition to whatever mana you get from tapping your lands. Remember, if Toph turns your artifacts into lands, you're getting extra landfall activations. If you wanted to, Great Divide Guide also gives your artifacts the ability to tap for mana. I think is barely worth it in this deck. This only applies to your non-token artifacts, so it's not super spammable, but I think the guide is still worth it because itself taps for mana. With so much of the deck being green, Emerald Medallion makes most of your stuff cost 1 less, except for Deep Gnome Tarotmancer, which ramps you whenever your opponents are trying to ramp, even if you're already ahead of them. At 3 mana, we get 2 more copies of Lotus Cobra and a bunch of these Harrow effects. You have to sacrifice a land, but you get to search for 2 lands and get 2 landfall triggers. Cycle of Renewal, Entish Restoration, Roiling Regrowth, just more of the same. Spring Bloom Druid does it as a creature entering the battlefield. Dire Strain Rampage I think is kind of interesting. You can use it either as a removal spell on your opponent's stuff, or if you target your own land, then it gets replaced with 2 lands. And finally, the most important version of this effect for this deck is the Larval Scoutlander. In case you missed it, when you earthbend a land and that land dies, it returns to the battlefield. So, if you sacrifice the Scoutlander as a land, it'll re-enter the battlefield, it'll do the thing again. To finish us off, Azusa and the Jolly Green Bedroom Eyes allow us to play even more lands each turn. At 4 mana, we should probably just be casting our commander, but if you're not ready to combo off with artifacts yet, the other Toph gives us a repeatable earthbending effect every time we cast a spell. We can reuse our fetch lands, and when you cast something like Cycle of Renewal, you can earthbend onto the land that you sacrificed. That land will come back, in addition to the 2 lands that you search for. Also at 4 mana, Mean and Den are a little bit expensive for what they do, but you could do some fun things with returning lands to your hand, returning artifacts to your hand after Toph has turned them into lands. The trample can sometimes be a way of closing out the game, sometimes giving an opponent's creature trample to kill a different opponent. But the main problem with the ability to play extra lands, sometimes you just run out of lands to play. In that case, Oracle Moldai allows you to play lands off the top of your library. If you imagine every time you search your library, every time you shuffle your library, that's another different card on top. That's another chance to get an extra land. These are lands that you don't have to draw, so when you play them from your library, it's like drawing a card. Even better, Ice Till Explorer allows you to play lands from the graveyard, so you can replay all of these lands you're sacrificing. And then, at the top of the curve, Awaken the Woods doubles your mana. However much you have, that's how much you spend, that's how much you get. And all of these forests entering the battlefield will trigger all of your landfall abilities. World Soul's Rage is a little bit more limited in how many lands you can get, but you can use the damage as a way of removing a problematic creature or a problematic player. I like both of these as sort of filler. You can cast them anytime, whether you have 4 mana or 14 mana. Speaking of landfall, Traveling Chocobo and Mom re-trigger all your landfall abilities. Ancient Green Warden is a little bit expensive for the same effect, but has the additional text. Being able to play lands from the graveyard I think is important enough to also include Crucible of Worlds and its spiritual successors. Renin 6 does something slightly worse for slightly less mana. At this point, we should acknowledge the deck is 60% ramp. We haven't answered the question, how can we touch more cards? How can we even win the game and not just waste everyone's time? Usually you pick a commander that does these things, but Toph doesn't at face value, so what even is the point of having Toph as the commander? So, focusing on Toph, remember our artifacts are also lands. Any earthbent sacrifices will keep coming back. For example, Apple of Eden allows us to touch our opponent's cards. Memory Jar draws us 7 cards every time we sacrifice it, and Sandstone Oracle allows us to reload after we've emptied our hand. The Hideaway ability on Collector's Cage only allows us to pick 1 card, but we get to C5 and we get to cast it for free. Even though this isn't a dedicated +1 counters deck, Terra Symbiosis still draws us 2 cards every time we use Toph's Earthbending ability. And since all of these Earthbent lands are also creatures, Skullclamp draws you 2 cards every time you sacrifice one. Sylvan Library can be a little bit confusing to the uninitiated, but the idea is every turn you draw 2 extra cards, and then you put some of those back on top of your library. Every time you search your library, every time you shuffle your library, the bad cards get shuffled away, and then next turn you get to touch all new different cards. This deck doesn't have a lot of 1-for-1 interaction, but Portal to Phyrexia is a repeatable way of wiping out your opponent's creatures. Cataclysmic Gearhulk destroys other stuff too, while leaving your lands completely untouched. And the real Haymaker Admonition Angel is exiling your opponent's stuff with each landfall. Avenger Zendikar, Felidar Retreat, and the Cinnamon Jelly Bean are the old school win conditions for the landfall deck. Mossborn Hydra is more fragile, but it also costs less mana. Bristly Bill, only 2 mana will sometimes be enough. Geode Rager forces your opponents to attack each other, leaving them vulnerable to your attacks. Speaking of your attacks, Mirage gives you extra combat steps. Even if you don't attack, it still untaps all your creatures, including all your land creatures, creatures that could be used for mana or could be used for triggering additional landfall abilities. And finally, Mirage has a cute interaction with another Toph. This one earthbends every time you attack. More attacks means more earthbending. Okay, this type of deck could have a lot of interesting lands, but the ramp spells require us to have a lot of basic lands in the deck, so there's not that much room for too much wacky stuff. Buried Ruin gives us a way of getting artifacts back from the graveyard. Field of Ruin plays nicely with Crucible of Worlds and sometimes gives us extra landfall triggers. If you really want to get nasty, Dust Bowl gives us a repeatable way of sacrificing our Earthbent artifacts. And that's it. I wanted to make things not too complicated for a good friend Rarran. Take care everyone.